Ascension Island arose out of nothing. It was a volcanic eruption from the depths of the seabed that formed and formed and formed, and the magma went up, and eventually it surfaced and produced this island. Not a large island, but an island with a mountain, a volcanic structure on the top, which continued erupting for a while and then settled down and left this this rocky hulk sitting in the middle of the South Atlantic, 1,000 miles from anywhere. The winds that blew across the island brought very little rain. What rain did fall disappeared underground very fast into the volcanic ash. There was no means of life there. There was no way that plants could survive, no way that humans could survive, because there was no water. There are a few reports over the centuries of castaways landing on the island, occasionally people being dumped there by passing ships. These people didn't survive. There was no means for them to survive. There was no food, there was no water. It was a desert. So the British, while establishing their empire around the world in the early 19th century, used it as a stopping off point, a refueling point, before they carried on to southern Africa or round into Asia. And they decided they wanted to make it a bit more habitable. Once the British had decided to have a settlement there, they needed to make it a place which could live on its own, which wasn't constantly relying on supplies being brought in. So they tried to engineer the island to a place which would produce, which could sustain life. The island became a test case for the idea that we could re-engineer the environment around the world, that we could make our environments in the way that we wanted them. And Joseph Hooker, a young botanist, came to the island and proposed the idea of planting trees on the bare volcanic wasteland of the mountain. Any kind of geoengineering that we're going to do is always going to reflect our own priorities, our own values, our own sense of what we want. The Victorians had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do on the island. They wanted to, in some ways, recreate England in the South Atlantic. So they brought in British livestock, they brought in sheep, they brought in cattle. They wanted to run an English farm. They wanted to sort of turn it into the South Downs, if you like. Terraforming is the idea that you can create your own environment, that you can recreate the planet in the form that you want it, that you don't have to rely entirely on the existing climate system or existing ecology. They began to have the idea that they might be able to modify the environment of the island itself, and in particular to produce some rainfall. There was a theory around that if you planted trees, they would seed essentially the clouds that would form over the mountain and encourage those clouds to produce rainfall. There was a mist on top of Green Mountain. There was no mist anywhere else, but it had encouraged the moisture there. And they did get extra rainfall on the mountain. This is not by any stretch of the imagination a natural forest. It's an extraordinary assembly. And yet, it is an ecosystem. That forest, that artificial forest, is changing the climate on that island by encouraging rainfall. And it is cooling the island as well, as trees do. So it was a geo-engineering activity on this strange volcanic mountain in the middle of nowhere. A green splash in a very dark moonscape.
Islands are, particularly in the early parts of the age of discovery, or the age of being discovered, depending which end of the ship you're looking at, islands have this very special status because they're one-offs. They're very good to play with in the imagination. You can't really make up whole continents, but the idea of an island as like embodying an idea. For instance, Utopia is an island. Robinson Crusoe recreates capitalism on an island. The Tempest takes place on an island. This idea of these places which are almost of the imagination gets projected onto real islands. Hooker and others have an idea that Ascension can be made into a more habitable place. And they think that greenery is the way to do that. They think that botany is the tool that they have for remaking the environment in a way that makes it better for people. The idea that the human influence on the Earth, which is perceived as primarily benign, can be intentionally increased becomes a very strong part of 19th century scientific thinking. But control is an extremely hard thing to really imagine here. They wanted the top of the island to be farmable, and that didn't really work out. So they never got exactly what they wanted, but they definitely got something. There was a debate in the late 80s, early 90s about the whole word terraforming. Some people chose to prefer the term ecopoiesis, the making of an ecosystem, or the forming of an ecosystem. And I think that what you're seeing on Ascension Island is in fact more like ecopoiesis than it is like terraforming. It's not turning into the thing it was designed to be by Hooker, but there is some sense of life having found a way that isn't exactly the way that the people who wanted to change the island wanted. The Earth has gone through its own ecopoiesis, it's gone through its own act of becoming. Humans are not just a part of it, but a very important part of it. And one of the strange things about what we're doing to the planet is that at the same time it seems more alienating from the planet, and also to make us more a part of the planet than ever before. Very few people, I think, want to engage in geoengineering, but the ambition to reduce the harm done by climate change drives people to think about what they think might be necessary in that regard. It feels like making the Earth a machine for humans to live in, and that's discomforting. The idea that there's a nature that humans shouldn't tamper with. And I understand that, but I honestly feel that it's just, in some ways, too late.
DST, fra. DST, retro.
There, and then temple. Why can't I do that? 29, running low on wood. And if we're running on low on wood, you little ladies will go and mine. Just go there.
Sometimes we think that reality is one thing, and we simply call it reality, the only one there is. But it's useful, I think, to consider that reality appears in many different shapes according to different perspectives that we adopt towards them. For this reason, it might be useful to consider reality not so much as reality, but as a reality system. Different people have different ways of entertaining these ideas, and they create for themselves different realities, which means different worlds. Of course, it is inevitable that your current belief about the world in which you're living go to affect the kind of world that you recreate. If you think that the ideas about reality that are entertained by your world are not just ideas, are the truth, it's really like that, then inevitably, whichever world you will go to create will be the same. In a world that is only an interplay of forces asserting your force, as was typical in the 19th century, or early 20th century, becomes the point. In a world that is increasingly material, this goes to affect the idea of the good, it goes to affect the structure of society, it goes to affect the political discourse. To reimagine the world from scratch, from zero, outside of the current idea about reality, is very complicated because it means literally to die to your own world and be reborn in another world. That is the real challenge, I think, at a moment in which we are on the verge of reprojecting our world, and we're running the risk of reprojecting the same. We could say, starting from the 17th century, 18th, we start having a different way of understanding how reality is made. For example, we move from a world that is populated by creatures on many different dimensions, animals, humans, angels, God, to a world that is populated by creatures that all exist on the same dimension. We develop a scientific language. Scientific language is specific to a certain way of looking at the world. like all the other languages and like all the other views of the world, in itself is not an accurate picture of the truth. It's a certain way of understanding, of fictionalizing reality. And this world is authentic, is real to a certain extent, it's effective. But in certain moments in history, it becomes so opaque that it becomes impossible to see through it. So it's no longer remembered that these are grids that we use in order to make sense of a reality behind it that is beyond our grasp, but we start confusing it for the truth. And it becomes so similar to the truth that we take it for nature.
The fundamental purpose of creating a system of classification is understanding the world in which you live, I think, and any system of classification is a reflection of how we look at the world around us, because it will never reflect the way the natural world really is. It's almost a property of being human, I would say. You put things into groups. How these groups are arranged differ depending on your culture and where you live. But if you think about Western taxonomy or classification, there's an underlying economic importance at play. Joseph Hooker was part of a network of fellows of the Linnean Society. Botanists or naturalists would have been employed by companies like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, and in that capacity they bring back plants and animals as specimens and revolutionize the way naturalists at the time could communicate between each other about specific species that they encountered. A lot of the drive behind it is to try and find plants and animals, species, but particularly plants, that will enable European powers to overview and regulate and domesticate the natural world. So there's an element of curiosity just because they want to know, but there's also an element that they live in an expanding world. They live in countries that want to expand their own spheres of influence to other countries for economic purposes. And so the study of the natural world kind of underpins that desire for expansion and colonialism as well.
we could say terraforming is an attempt to build or change worlds. Well, what do you think a world is, and what do you think a world is for? Because if you start asking that question, you're going to get a million different kinds of answers, depending on who you ask. Terraforming has built into it the idea that what sort of terra you want to form would be something Earth-like. And I think that's also worth examining as well, because Earth is so many different kinds of places, so many different kinds of climates, so many different kinds of human realities. We could look at a scientific definition of an Earth-like planet. We could look at cultural definitions of Earth-like relationships between humans and the planet Earth. We could look at removing humans from the equation and saying what were, or what should be the ideal climates here or ideal ecosystems. Those are all realities, but we too often forget that what we're really designing is who gets to be in the space. So we've gained these new tools, we've gained these new capabilities. And again, we in the broadest sense of like the biological human subject that can affect change on planet Earth, has gained the capability to change the weather, to change the climate, to massively disrupt the geologic systems and the biological systems and the ecological systems, in that fragile zone between the edge of space and the edge of lava, right? Which is very, very thin, but we can mess with it. And there is a forming, whether it's a terraforming or an anti-terraforming. There's human agency that is changing the planetary body of Earth, Terra, at the largest possible scales. And it begs questions of human capacity to engage with really, really complicated systems that we maybe don't admit often enough that we don't understand.
From the moment when NASA is tasked with going to the moon, some of them realize that they have an unparalleled communications problem. All the time that the Apollo missions were up, they needed to have communications with them. You can't have communications with an orbiting satellite from just one place on the Earth because you can't always see the satellite. And so it was a reason why the Americans had to develop a global set of radio receivers and radio transmitters that were capable of keeping in contact with the spacecraft. Ascension was one of those nodes. When planetary missions, when space probes started reaching Mars and seeing how un-Earth-like it was, that fed parascientific speculation about how you would make Mars more Earth-like, how you would terraform it, how you would thicken its atmosphere, melt its ice caps, warm its surface. And in the 1990s, a British ecologist, David Wilkinson, pointed out that a very good analogy to this was what had happened on Ascension Island, that the greening of Green Mountain was effectively a piece of terraforming.
Mars has been many different kinds of place over the course of its 4.5 or 5 billion year lifespan. Mars was once seemingly as wet and as atmospherically rich as Earth, but that lack of a magnetosphere left it vulnerable to cosmic rays, sort of plucking away the water and the air, bit by bit. We could look at a place like the Moon or Mars in the terms that, say, Buzz Aldrin used when he walked on the surface of the Moon. I think he called it magnificent desolation, that it's an empty place, that there is no nature here in the way that humans usually tend to understand that term. But I think by observing a place like Mars on its own terms and let fall our preconceived notions about what a nature is, we might see a lot more than desolation.
I think the idea of Ascension as a very barren place to which life has been brought plays into ideas of Mars. But Mars is incredibly old. Even the new bits of the surface are billions of years old. Ascension Island is incredibly young. Everything's still rugged. It's almost still warm with the heat of the Earth that bore it. So there's an interesting moral question there about, is it right to try and make it into some sort of like green and pleasant land? Or is there a respect that's actually due to an emptiness, to a barrenness? Humans have a tendency to equate the natural and the living. It's in the life of nature that people find much of its value. And when people think about deserts, it's often their want of life or their potential for brief spurts of life after a single shower or something like that, which motivates people. But nature doesn't have to be alive. Nature doesn't have to be ecosystems. And if you look beyond the Earth, you will find that that which is natural is naturally, remarkably, shockingly, inspiringly barren. This is sort of like the paradox at the heart of terraforming. If you make something into something utterly other from itself, at some level you're betraying its nature, but at the same time you are bringing what we think of as nature to it. You are making it green, you are making it moist, you are making it lush, you are making it a place that you can imagine yourself. And this comes back to Ascension. Nature is as socially constructed, almost more socially constructed than any of the other big terms with which we try to come to terms with the world. And so if you want to change a climate in a way that in some sense nature might prefer, you are always doing the unnatural in service of nature. Sometimes the way to conserve something is to maintain its lifelessness, its difficulty, its desertness.
If we're going to be practitioners of the design of world systems, we have to be students of world systems as well. There's the kind of Rousseauian concept of like an original sin, a fall from, you know, a state of nature into this state of exception that is separate from nature, partly because, you know, we seem to have this ability to, for better or worse, affect, you know, big scale environments. Just the acknowledgement of an Anthropocene is also an acknowledgement of, you know, pulling apart from an idea of nature over here and an idea of humanity over here. But I think you have to go back in because there is that inextricability that is impossible to get away from. As humans interact with different environments than the environment that has deeply shaped us so far, all those environments we will attempt to change, we will attempt to terraform in different ways, again, for better or worse. But those environments also will anthroform, right? That interaction is going to go two ways. And we fail in any kind of terraforming or any kind of world building at the scale of the spacesuit or at the scale of another planet to the extent that we forget that we depend on all kinds of other things that are not like us. Because if there's anything we've learned from, you know, the world system that we've studied for the longest, is that that's its defining characteristic.
Biophilia is the idea that human beings have an innate, instinctive connection to the non-human natural world. That we do have this evolved connection to non-human nature. And when we're confronted with artificial environments like Ascension Island, we're sort of unconsciously picking up on something about those places which is not, doesn't feel right. Maybe they don't sound right, or maybe there are types of plants together that shouldn't be together, and we're registering that. Biophilia is part of the human condition, does that mean that we're registering places like Ascension Island in a quite different way, and a way that we're not fully conscious of. I think many people believe that, or are moved by the thought that because non-human living things have purposes of their own, that there is an ethics of how we ought to engage with and treat non-human nature. And of course, places like Ascension Island, I mean, very heavily designed and engineered and deliberately manipulated to be a certain way. You know, human beings have created this place. And so actually we can do what we like. We could actually sort of uproot everything and start again, so to speak, because this is so artificial in that sense. Nevertheless, the ecosystems and the living things that are there have purposes in this very broad sense. And so, you know, human beings have created this place. So human beings perhaps have a duty to maintain it as such a place. Because we can't turn the clock back. Once you've lost a pristine environment, and once you've created a highly artificial environment, it's then impossible to turn the clock back.
Humans matter on a planetary scale in a way that they did not 500 years ago. You can't really talk about the planet while ignoring that. Of course, in bulk terms, humans haven't actually changed the planet all that much, but in terms of the way it works, the way things flow around it, they have. And so you have to see the Earth system as being at least partially human-derived. At the same time, that always gets you into the sense of whether the Earth system is under human control, and I think it's fairly clear that it's not. Humans have a lot of power over the Earth system, but they don't have an ability to control it because they don't have an ability to control themselves. humans are deeply involved in the Earth system, and I don't think that the response to that is to try and completely disentangle humans from the Earth system. I don't think what we want is effectively to live in moon bases on Earth, entirely sealed off from the rest of the environment. And so there needs to be some sort of like new relationship between the natural and the human that isn't very well expressed at the moment. One of the constituents of that relationship, I think, is to understand, again, things in terms of process, in terms of flow, rather than in terms of stock or substance. The natural is not the tree, the natural is what the tree does. And a tree that happens to be parked, on a street in London, that tree is in some ways not natural, yet what it does when it takes in the air and when it takes up the water and when it does that wonderful, miraculous thing of photosynthesizing, that's still natural, it's just in an artificial setting. There's a metaphor that Bruno Latour used to talk about, Frankenstein's monster. The sin in Frankenstein's monster is not creating the monster, or the creature, more properly. It's abandoning it. It's being so sickened by the sight of it as to leave it and run away and not do anything with it. And I do think that applies to the industrialization of the Earth system. It's shocking. And to think that it's been done by us in some way, or by the capitalist system in which we partake, or whatever, that is in some ways a terrifying thought. But once you're there, once you've done it, then you have a certain obligation towards it. Not to try and undo it, not to kill it, not to go back to a world without it, because the creature is a wonderful thing. But also it is a monster and needs to be challenged.